Finally, in terms of a broad answer as to why God blesses atheists, there is this answer. How did people get to be atheistic? Somehow in their life experience, they had experienced things that made them believe there is no God, there is no hope. And if somebody has come to that negative and empty conclusion, it is because their life experiences have pointed them that way. And so they, more than anyone, need your blessing and God's blessing and God's healing power. But I want to go beyond those broad answers as to why we and God should bless the atheists to some more specific questions about how people get to be atheists. And I want to suggest this. Many people, I believe, are atheists because when they look at the church and what the church has done through history, say to themselves, if that is the manifestation of God in this world, I reject that God. Now, there may be people who are atheists for some other reason, but I think in large part, atheists are people who are disillusioned because of the way the church has behaved through history. Let me give you a few prime examples. When slavery was at its peak in the southern United States, who was the foremost proponent of continuing the slave culture? And the answer is simple. It was the Christian church. It was wealthy Christian business people who had the belief that if you were good and righteous, God would bless you with health and wealth and strength and lots of slaves, and that's the way it was meant to be. And wonderful, eloquent sermons were preached from Christian pulpits of all denominations saying, you know, God meant certain people to be rulers and others to be slaves, and to defy that is to defy God's natural order. The church spoke openly in favor of slavery. And while it may be in the end that it was some people in the context of the church who opposed slavery, the vast majority of Christians thought it was a great idea. Likewise, when apartheid was at its strongest in South Africa, who was the strongest proponent of apartheid? It was the Christian church saying this is the way that God meant societies to be. People should not be commingling. It is contrary to God's nature. And if you look at events like that and say, what is this thing, the church, and how can we take it seriously? You understand how some people could say, there is no God. There are even more grave and frightening examples of the wrong of which the church has done throughout history. If, for example, you look at the role of the Christian church in Germany during the Second World War, you will be absolutely appalled. Remember, Germany was a thoroughly Christian nation, evangelical and conservative, and yet Christians stood by as Hitler came to power. And when Hitler began to round up the Jews, those good solid Christians looked on and said, well, you know, we don't like what's happening. But we read Scripture as a literal document, and we know that in Scripture, historically and literally, the Jews are responsible for Christ's death. So they did nothing. They stood silent as the worst atrocity against humankind in history unfolded, and Christians, by and large, said, that's okay. And then when Hitler began to round up gay and lesbian persons, once again the Christians stood by and said, well, you know, Scripture gay or lesbian is wrong, so I don't think we're going to stop him. When Hitler rounded up the gypsies, the Christians stood by and said, well, they're all thieves anyway. And when Hitler rounded up people with physical challenges and disabilities, the Christians stood by, quoting the Old Testament, saying that anyone with a physical defect should not go into God's temple, and so they were silent. The Christian church, even in its most conservative and evangelical form, has terrible things to answer for throughout history. In Canada, if we look at the church's history with respect to residential schools for Native children, or, and I hate to push this one out because it is so appalling, our own history of sexual abuse within Christian churches in Canada, you can understand how somebody could look at those things or anything else in the church's vast history and say, is this the manifestation of God in the world? And how they would say, if so, I reject that God. Or there is no God. Or if there is a God like that, it is no God whatsoever. The church has a history of cruelty and callousness and hurt that we must claim and own up to and turn to the atheists and say, you've got a point. Beyond that, if we look at the church today, we recognize that there is hypocrisy within it. You all know that today and tomorrow and every day, 30,000 children die of hunger. And it should be the church's main goal to be doing mission to save those lives and change the societies in which those children live. And yet, for the most part, many churches pour their energy into meaningless, superficial, theological debates about who is allowed to come to church and who is not allowed to come. Is it any wonder there is a portion of our society that is very cynical and very bitter about what the church is? Beyond that, there are other things. Whenever the church is strong, it develops an overbearing and domineering attitude, which causes us to say things like this: we have found the right way and the only way to God. And everyone else outside of us is wrong and is condemned to eternal punishment. We are right, everyone else is wrong, we've got it figured out. And every church, even Presbyterians, are guilty of saying that at one point or another. We have gladly evolved to the point where we can make that statement that I used from the Living Faith this morning, where we recognize that there is truth and goodness in other religions as well as in our own, but still we have this history, and in certain places in the Christian church, there is still this feeling, only Christians have it right, everyone else is wrong. And in a postmodern society, in the 21st century, any thinking person with any kind of connection to someone outside of the Christian church knows that those narrow statements are corrupt and hopeless.